got underway after they rendezvoused, and the next morning, when about the January the 12th, Halsey announced on the loudspeaker system on the Enterprise, this force is bound for Tokyo, which caused a lot of excitement among the crew. 4 days later, 1,000 miles west of Tokyo, the launch was scheduled for April 18th. So the task 18th, the task force reached Admiral Yamato's small craft picket line. He had small craft out there to report back to Tokyo. Well, they picked up this Task Force 18 and its ships coming in there, and happily they sent incomplete reports back to Tokyo. And Halsey decided with his cover blown, he wanted to get 150 miles closer before he launched, but he ordered an immediate launch of the B-24s. Weather was miserable, but miraculously all 16 planes took off successfully, aided by a 17-mile-per-hour headwind. The weather was just gassy, which is exactly what they wanted. So I remember they said once they got on the deck in there was Lieutenant Miller and then the Colonel Doolittle, and Colonel Doolittle said, looked at him seated up there, and he said, "What do you mean telling me that you have?" The Navy lieutenant had told him that he'd taken off from a carrier, a 500-foot deck, and had 50 feet left. Colonel Doolittle said, what do you call that in the Navy? Bullshit? One of Yamato's little picket vessels had reported there were 3 carriers, which Yamamoto he almost didn't believe that, because all we had were 4 carriers. We weren't going to commit 3 over there. So he concluded that the carriers were 4,550 miles from the launch position. They really were only, and that they would continue to approach Tokyo, and Tokyo could not be hit before the following morning, being April 19th. Well, the first bomber in the B-24 group arrived over Tokyo just before noon on April the 18th. So that was a happy conclusion for our side that he thought that. The bombers hit several targets in Tokyo, flew directly over the Imperial Palace, but had explicit orders not to bomb there. When Yamamoto was told that they had actually bombed Tokyo, he became ill and realized that Tokyo had been bombed from the air, and then decided upon his plan to capture Midway ultimately, because he erroneously assumed that these planes had come from carriers from Midway, and he considered that the central point of the American forces. The minute that we discharged our planes, Task Force 16 immediately reversed course, literally hauled ass east, and escaped into the cold, interminable waters of the North Pacific. All 16 bombers reached the East China Sea, navigating by dead reckoning. They were running low on fuel, so Doolittle and his crew bailed out, as did 14 other crews, hoping they were going to land on the China coast. One plane turned northward and ultimately landed at Vladivostok in Russia, where the crew was interned by the Soviets for more than a year. Of 80 airmen. There were 5 airmen per plane, and 16 planes. Only 4 were killed in action. Of the remaining 76, only 8 were captured by the Chinese, by the Japanese. Subsequently, 3 of those were executed by Japan. Coupled with that, and then in the Philippines, on Bataan on April the 9th, and they had no plan to handle the 78,000 American and Filipino troops, resulted in the Bataan Death March. You remember that? Some 10,000 Allied prisoners were murdered on that march, one of the most infamous atrocities of World War II. That event, Doolittle's raid, and Japan's subsequent execution of 3 Doolittle crew members embittered both sides and brutalized the war. In China, immediately after the Doolittle raid, the Japs went into 2 provinces, Chinese provinces, along the coastline. They slaughtered thousands of civilians who were suspected of having aided the flyers. And the Chiang Kai-shek called FDR to tell him about that and complain. So I think that's the tempo for the Japanese soldiers and sailors we encountered later in the war. They were absolutely ruthless. They were willing to die for the emperor, and that's just how that thing happened. Of all the events that happened in 1942 by the Navy, Halsey did a daring raid into the Marshall Islands on February 1st, 1942. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo was April 18th of 42. The Battle of the Coral Sea, way down in the South Pacific, occurred on May 1 to 442. And May the 7th to 842 came out with a great victory for the Americans. And then the last big event was the Battle of Midway. Then to the Battle of Midway, where the Enterprise and the Yorktown Arcarius dive bombers ambushed what they called Keto Butai, which was the Japanese fleet. And we sank 3 of their 4 carriers, did numerous damage to their ships, and totally defeated the Japanese there, which gave us a little breathing spell. So Yamamoto, by I guess being influenced so much by Doolittle's raid on Tokyo and his erroneous assumption that the Japs had to capture Midway, he made the attack on there. We surprised him and really turned the direction of the war around. We had a long way to go because in the Pacific, and we'd set the goal shortly after Churchill left Washington in January of 42. Admiral King was in charge, was a trusted naval advisor for Roosevelt. He had 2 primary goals: that Hawaii must not fall to the Japanese, and Australia must not fall to the Japanese. So that was the overriding deal of our policy in the Pacific. It turned out extremely well. Admiral Chester Nimitz was our commander in the Pacific. He's from Fredericksburg, Texas. If you ever go there, the Nimitz Museum is an absolutely wonderful place to visit. They have recreated there the entire war in the Pacific from all the island invasions. You start through this museum and you just go from one to the next. It's a chronological sequence of all the places that we had to do invasions in the Pacific. Of course, the Japs, meantime, had fortified all those islands, left garrisons on them, and they really intended to take Australia. But the Battle of the Coral Sea had much to do in changing that thing around. So I think sometimes the Navy did most of the fighting out there, but Doolittle's volunteer pilots had a tremendous influence on the direction of the war in the Pacific and getting Yamamoto's focus that he had to take Midway, which he really did not have to do. But there's this book. I want to recommend it to any of you. Again, it's called Pacific Crucible. It gives me more information than I or anyone could cover in the time we have for this program here. But that's my summary. It was what happened. That only gets us to halfway through 1942, but that really determined what we were going to do there. The statistics in here on what Roosevelt or FDR came up with from the War Production Board are absolutely astounding. We produced 25 times as much wartime production in planes and tanks and ships as Germany had, as Japan had, and our industrial empire just kicked into gear. Realistically, that's why we ultimately prevailed in the war. We overwhelmed them. Another problem the Japanese had, as they lost fighters, the Zeros were made somewhere off limits. They were hauled in through a rice paddy to be delivered. Their pilots had a lot of training. When they took a toll on pilots, they could not replace the pilots. So we just, I guess, overwhelmed them with men and materials and ships after we got them. We started getting delivery on new ships before the end of 42, so we had those available in 43. I apologize that I didn't have more time to do a better organizational job here, but I'll take any questions and do my best to answer them. Thank you. If I go through this again, I'll do a much better job of organizing it. There's just so much in this book. It's unbelievable.
Got a question back here.
Yeah.
I've read that book, and actually you did an excellent job of summarizing it. There's a tremendous amount of information.
Well, I've never read a book, Professor, that had so many facets to it and was so thoroughly researched. I mean, the relationship between FDR and Churchill was just remarkable. And between the Navy's admirals in the Pacific, Nimitz, Halsey was the outgoing, brash guy, willing to take chances, lucked out a couple of times, but ultimately Nimitz controlled everything, and then Admiral Spruance was a much better task force commander than Halsey was. But Halsey was the guy that he was go get 'em Bill. So, but it's fascinating the background this guy goes into in this book.